Hey, what's going on, guys? Joe Munoz. Welcome to the V1 cut briefing video. And in future segments, we'll talk all other things single engine operations, including the ILS and the go around. But here particularly, this is the engine failure off of the runway, the V1 cut. All right, now contrary to popular belief, it's really not as difficult as maybe you've heard it to be. I'm going to offer some tips here to hopefully help you in this phase of your training. Let's talk about it here on the whiteboard. So the first thing is this, the V1 cut, the engine's going to fail, guess where? You guessed it, at V1, okay? And the beauty of this, in terms of what makes it a relatively easy maneuver to fly, is the fact that you still have visual reference to the runway, particularly if the instructor has programmed the sim properly. See, if the engine fails right at V1, remember V1 is the decision speed, the go, no go decision, you're still on the runway, and the benefit of that is you still have visual reference to the center line. Now, let me make one or maybe two things known to you here. There are two factors that are going to affect the needed rudder pressure for any given phase of flight. Now, the first one happens to be thrust, okay? So thrust output will affect the needed rudder pressure. The second thing happens to be airspeed, okay? And specifically, we're talking indicated airspeed that's felt over the vertical stabilizer and rudder. So now, let's look at how this plays out on the takeoff roll. And at the V1 moment, and I'm going to give you two views, one of which is a top-down bird's eye view, and over here we have more of a profile view that we're going to look at in order for you to see exactly how this would look, well, from just a little different angle here, all right? So when the engine fails, and we're going to use the example of a number one engine failure here, okay? So the number one engine fails over here. Number two, still pushing, still giving us thrust. Let's assume for just a minute, okay, that you did nothing. Let's assume you did absolutely nothing with your rudder pedals, and you would expect for the aircraft to, of course, yaw and drift off. In this case, you're still on the ground, right? So it's going to kind of turn off in the direction of the dead engine. So that's exactly what we're trying to counter. And in this particular example, here's your rudder pedals down below the runway. We're going to apply right rudder pressure for a number one engine failure to track, here's the key, parallel to the center line. If you're taking notes, write this down. You want to go parallel to the center line prior to the rotation of the airplane. So you parallel the center line, and of course, as you parallel the center line, you need to think about what are the things that affect the needed rudder. And the first one is thrust. Now, of course, here we have takeoff thrust, and it's a constant thrust, so there is no thrust variation. There is, however, a speed variation. There's an airspeed variation, and as a result of the airspeed variation, that need for rudder pressure will vary. Specifically, it'll be less and less and less because you're accelerating down the runway, and the faster you go, the more effective the rudder, and hence you will need less pressure. Now, let's understand that when your pilot monitoring says V1 rotate, that is not a command to rotate the airplane. He's not saying, hey, pull the airplane back right now. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, captain, or pilot flying specifically, right? We have reached the speed where rotation can occur and we can take the aircraft airborne. So it is an acknowledgement of speed being achieved, not so much a command to rotate. Now the reason I say that is you want to take your time rotating off the runway, number one, so that we can parallel the center line, make sure we have good directional control. At the same time, don't fall asleep on the runway, okay? If you fall asleep on me here, come on, stick with me. If you fall asleep and you take too long, okay, rotating, now you're cutting into your second segment climb performance, and that's certainly not the idea. That's not what we want to do either. All right, so smooth rotation, slight, subtle delay as you try to parallel center line, make sure you have good directional control, but not enough to really be cutting into aggressively into that second segment climb segment. You smoothly rotate off. I like to use the analogy of flying through the goalpost. Now, those of you that know American football, you know a goalpost looks much like what you see on the whiteboard here behind me. And the reason you want to fly through the goalpost visually, this is a mental picture that you're painting in your head, because we understand that we have PTS tolerances, right? And if we're departing, let's just use for Wright and Kennedy with a runway heading of approximately 045, we want to track a heading of 045. We do not want to deviate too far left. We certainly don't want to deviate too far right. We're trying to track runway heading within about plus or minus 5 degrees. Give you some tight tolerance there, all right? Plus or minus 5 degrees. Fly yourself through that goalpost as mentioned, all right? And now we're going to look at the actual rudder mechanics as we rotate airborne. So you smoothly rotate off, you lock that rudder pressure in, whatever it happens to be, you lock it in, smoothly rotate off, and do not, here's an incredible tip for you, please, if you're taking notes, write this one down. Do not go above the flight director. Do not go above the flight director. Do not, for the third time, do not go above the flight director. All together now, for the fourth time. Do not go above the flight director, okay? All right, the person recording this right now is looking at me like I'm crazy. Okay, so look, check it out, check it out. Let me share with you why you don't want to go above the flight director, okay? If you go above the flight director, let's take all this off for just a moment. Remember, there's two things that affect, okay, there's two things that affect how much rudder pressure is needed. They're on the board. One is thrust, two is airspeed. Now, if the flight director is here, and you are perfectly centered on it, then you will keep airspeed on your side, which means you will have the needed energy to have an effective rudder to maintain directional control on the climb out. Did I say that slow enough? Or maybe fast enough? Okay, let me say that again. You want the flight director in, or the aircraft symbol in the flight director so that you don't have a speed decay. Let me share with you how that could be a bad thing. You see, if you pitch up, and this is probably one of the most common things we see in sim training, flight crew will pitch up, the pilot here pitches above the flight director. The second you pitch above the flight director, airspeed will decay. When you have an airspeed decrease, the effectiveness of the flight control surface, here being the rudder, will be decreased. That is not what you want in single engine operations, certainly not in this phase of flight, okay, which is the takeoff. The takeoff phase of flight has the characteristics, three characteristics that are shared also with the go-around. Here's some more notes for you. The first of which is a high angle of attack, okay, has a high thrust setting, and it also has a low speed. So let's think about that for a minute, okay, as you read that craziness I wrote on the board, right? You have a high angle of attack, high thrust, low speed. So you're pitched way back with all this power, very low speed. The last thing you want to do is get an even lower speed by going above the flight director, and now you have that airspeed decay. Ultimately, it's going to lead to having an ineffective rudder surface. So far, what you should have taken out of this clip is the following. Parallel the center line, rotate smoothly, understand the rotation is not a command. That call out rotate's not a command, it's an acknowledgement of speed. Don't fall asleep so we don't cut in a second segment climb. Smoothly rotate the airplane off, lock that rudder pressure in, go to the flight director, never above, into the flight director so we don't have a speed decay that later on would cause us to run out of rudder authority. Now let's continue moving on with some other stuff here, all right? And then we're going to wrap this video up, and then we're going to look into how to actually fly the profile, the single engine ILS, the single engine go around, okay? Couple things you need to be mindful of, and you've heard this from day one, private pilot, right? Step on the ball. To keep coordinated, step on the ball, step on the ball, step on the ball, right? And that's true, but I want to share something else with you here that I like to call looking for the wing that's coming up and squashing it. You're literally going to step on the wing that's moving up. And the reason you're going to do that is because this aircraft, okay, transport category jet, has a swept wing. Contrary to an ATR, a Cessna 172, a Saab 340, maybe a Metroliner like what I flew, where the wing was a straight wing like this, these wings are swept. Now what that means is they're susceptible to something known as yaw-roll coupling. A yaw will couple or cause a roll. And so if you do not have sufficient, let's say you rotate off, that number one engine's failed, you don't have sufficient rudder pressure, you would begin to yaw in the direction of the dead engine that will couple to a roll. And so the first indication that you have insufficient pressure is you're going to see this roll-off happening on your attitude indicator. If you just stay laser focused on the attitude indicator, you see this wing moving up, you immediately step on it with additional pressure on the side of the upward moving wing. So here in this case it would be right rudder pressure. And then you reference the ball down here, okay? And you, of course, then step on the ball. So the first thing you want to do is apply rudder on the wing that's moving up and then immediately reference the ball. If you can get that slip skid indicator centered, you're always going to be flying in an optimal position that has aerodynamic airflow over the surface in the best way possible to give you the most amount of control effectiveness. All right, so this is some of the keys. We're going to follow up here in another video that talks about the single engine ILS and the go-around sequence. And of course, if you need to go back, rewatch, pause, play, and learn this the easy way, do so right here. We'll see you in the next video segment.